had to write all this the moment it came flooding back, and I'll try to get every detail straight, even though my mind keeps jumping around to different points in time. I served for nearly 20 years as an Air Force mechanic, primarily stationed at Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, starting in 1994. I had re-enlisted a couple of times before retiring in 2013. People usually think of mechanics as just turning wrenches on planes, and occasionally having to pull an all-nighter swapping out a busted part. But I got a crash course in some unusually classified materials when I was assigned to an off-site hangar maintenance detail in late 2007. The hangar was in a restricted zone used mostly for hush-hush tech tests, and we were told flat out that any conversations outside or inside the hangar about operations there would be considered a breach of protocol. This detail was normally only a couple of days, and I'd done something similar in the past without seeing anything but half-disassembled aircraft. This time, though, when I arrived, there were a couple of big crates in the corner clearly marked in ways I'd never seen. They had a weird series of codes and some kind of reptile symbol that didn't make a lick of sense to me. My supervisor didn't directly mention them, just told me which B-2 parts needed routine reassembly. I tried to ignore those crates, but the next day I heard voices in a closed-off portion of the hangar, discussing some type of infiltration data. I know it sounds like sci-fi, but the words that kept coming up sounded like they were talking about hidden bases in remote areas of the southwestern deserts. The strangest thing was a mention of reptile features, or reptilian aspects, like they were describing some infiltration threat. I couldn't make heads or tails of it until later that night, when I was rummaging for the correct torque sensor in a storage closet. Inside that closet were two boxes that definitely did not belong there. They were labeled with identical codes to the crates I'd seen earlier. One box was open, so I took a quick peek. I found a folder containing old typed documents, some dating back to the 1960s, referencing sightings of scaled humanoid entities near places like Dulce in New Mexico and the Mammoth Cave system in Kentucky. I practically broke into a sweat because I could tell these were official documents, not speculation from some random UFO enthusiast. They had official letterheads, project codes, and even redacted testimonies. One described a government operative who encountered something with scaly skin in an underground facility near the Nevada test site. Another file mentioned joint operations with certain agencies to keep these occurrences under wraps, including references to sworn secrecy, which made me realize I was probably in over my head. I didn't want to get caught reading them, so I slid the folder back in and tried to pretend I'd never seen anything. For a while, I managed to push that memory to the back of my mind. I was worried half to death that something would come of it, but no one ever approached me or hinted that they suspected I'd seen those files. I completed my assignment and made sure to never wander around that hangar alone again. But from that moment on, my curiosity wouldn't quit. I felt like I'd stumbled onto a big puzzle I wasn't supposed to know existed. I did notice little things that I never paid attention to before. Once I was checking out a C-130 at a different base, and caught a glimpse of some official retrieving a locked briefcase from the control panel area. He was accompanied by a couple of guys in suits who didn't match any standard Air Force uniform or insignia. I couldn't help but wonder if it had something to do with those infiltration documents. I'm the type that can't let things go, so whenever I was doing remote assignments, I'd poke around base libraries or archives, though I tried to remain low-key about it. Most times I found nothing but typical flight logs, maintenance records, and the usual bureaucratic nonsense. Every so often, though, I'd stumble on references to subterranean anomalies or unacknowledged programs allegedly connected to these rumored scaled beings. Fast forward to 2012, I was still at Whiteman, but got temporarily detailed to Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida for a training exercise. That's when I heard talk of something extremely hush-hush going on at MacDill Air Force Base down near Tampa. A friend of mine in communications, who'd been around just as long as I had, let slip that top brass were investigating an incident in the Everglades. He hinted that it involved sightings of scaly creatures at night. I didn't press him further because we were in a common area with others around, and I didn't want to put him in a tight spot. But the mention of that was enough to raise my suspicions even higher. Now here's where I veer off a bit. Around the same time, I started noticing strange references in certain older flight manuals. Hidden in some footnotes, you'd see faint text about testing that wasn't the standard stealth or nighttime ops. I once saw a line item about live cargo requiring temperature-controlled hold for extended durations, referencing no typical cargo I'd ever heard of. I confronted a buddy who worked in logistics, and he shrugged it off as if he didn't want to know. It dawned on me that there's a sphere of operations happening behind the scenes, where the normal chain of command is bypassed, and only a few high-level people stay informed. I had a weird experience one evening while driving on Highway 366 in Arizona after I retired. I was on a personal road trip to visit some old pals. I pulled over to stretch my legs and got this overpowering feeling that something was watching me from the brush. I turned, and that's when I glimpsed some type of large canine creature standing up on two legs for just a moment before it bounded off. It was way larger than any coyote I'd seen, and the shape wasn't like a standard wolf. Maybe that's unrelated, but it fueled my sense that odd creatures exist out there, and were mostly kept in the dark by official channels. Whether I was paranoid or just hyper-attuned, I started connecting the dots. The government invests insane sums in classified programs, and from what those old documents implied, they clearly had knowledge of reptilian-like entities and were actively suppressing it. It might tie in with all those rumors about hidden entrances at certain desert bases, or maybe something deeper. The more I think about it, the more I recall certain older veterans hinting that half of what we did was decoys and illusions, so that the real projects could proceed unnoticed. I retired from the Coast Guard about 15 years ago, after spending the bulk of my career off the Oregon coast. And there's one stretch of time that I still can't get out of my head. From 1985 until about 1991, I was stationed mostly between Astoria and Newport, bouncing between smaller stations whenever staffing was short. I used to love driving along Highway 101 whenever I got shore leave. It was a good way to clear my head, and sometimes I'd just park overlooking the water and let the sounds of the surf be my only company. It seemed like the only time my mind would stop buzzing with the routines, the drills, and the call-outs. But something about the ocean there, especially in the dull glow of distant boat lights, always felt like it was hiding secrets. I saw a lot of strange lights over the water at night, and not all of it can be brushed off as fishing boats or marine flares. One night in late '87, I was near Cape Mears, doing a routine patrol with some of the younger guys, and we caught sight of something just hovering on the horizon. It wasn't doing that typical drifting that you'd see from boats. This was steady, almost anchored in the sky, but there was no noise. The guys tried to radio it in, but we had trouble getting a clear read on anything. I remember standing there on the deck thinking, this has to be some standard aircraft, but my gut was churning. The rest of that evening, as we moved further out, I kept catching glimpses of that object, maybe a half-mile away, maybe more, but always in the same spot relative to us, as if it was tracking our position. We never got an official answer, and after a few days, the chatter around it just died down. Nobody wanted to be the weirdo going on about unidentified lights. It wasn't the last time either. In early 1989, during a training exercise off Tillamook Head, right around twilight, we saw 5 or 6 bright orbs in a line formation out over the water. They seemed to move in sync, 2 stepping forward, the others trailing behind, that sort of thing. I recall hearing chatter from another vessel in the area, talking about how their navigational electronics went haywire for a good 3 minutes. We didn't lose power, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that we were dealing with something beyond our usual scope. When we finally returned to base, I overheard a couple of the older guys whispering about similar sightings going back decades. They swapped stories I had never heard before, about some massive triangle-shaped craft spotted near Depot Bay, or enormous beams of light shining into the water close to Coos Bay. Nobody wanted to file official reports because everything was either chalked up to illusions or brushed off by higher-ups who didn't want any trouble. The Coast Guard has a job to do, and getting wrapped up in UFO talk wasn't part of it. Honestly, The deeper I got into these stories, the more I realized there's a long history of bizarre sightings along that coastline. I remember one time, I was up near Seaside for a weekend, off duty and grabbing a late dinner. I got cornered by this local fisherman who recognized my uniform and started rambling about how he'd seen lights under the water for years, like submerged orbs gliding along just beneath the surface. He claimed that whenever he'd approach them in his boat, they'd vanish in an instant, leaving no trace. I never pressed him too hard because it felt like it was too off the rails. But then I heard a remarkably similar story from a friend over in Warrenton a few months later. It mostly ended up being these hushed discussions over a pint. You never saw them on any official forums. I got so fascinated by these rumors that I'd sometimes volunteer for nighttime patrols, half hoping I'd see the lights again. Well, in October '90, I finally did. It was about 2 a.m., pitch black out, and we were patrolling a few miles west of Yaquina Bay. I caught sight of a set of 3 intensely bright spheres floating over the water, maybe 500 feet above the waves. My shipmates saw it too, because a lot of us just stood there silent, practically forgetting our duties for a few moments. None of us said a word to command about it afterward. The next morning, I was in the mess hall and overheard somebody quietly mention that there'd been a flurry of calls to local departments about strange lights in the area. Of course, that went nowhere official. The usual line was that it was a weather balloon test or maritime flares from a wayward vessel, but I never bought that. You get enough time here, you know exactly what a flare looks like, and that sure wasn't it. I still keep in touch with a couple of close buddies from my days in uniform, and they confirm that these sightings haven't slowed down over the years. Up until I left the service, I'd hear an occasional mention in the rumor mill about hush-hush instructions from higher-ups just to not stir the pot. It's difficult, though, living with that stark memory of something that defies explanation. I sometimes catch myself scanning the night sky. It's this habit I can't shake, as if half of me is hoping to see them again, and the other half is relieved they're gone. They say the ocean holds countless mysteries, and I'm convinced that part of what I witnessed out there proves that some of them reach above the waterline, too. I've been assigned to that tower off and on since 2016, just to keep the transmitters running smoothly. The tower is located about 10 miles off Highway 375, which everyone around there calls the Extraterrestrial Highway anyway, so it's got this weird reputation. Normally, I don't pay much mind to local legends, but the past week has honestly shaken me more than I'd care to admit. It started last Wednesday at around 1 in the morning. I was out there because we'd been having intermittent power issues, so I was supposed to run a diagnostic on the backup generator and do a quick inspection of the antenna array. I drive an old 1998 Tahoe, and it's got a hell of a squeaky belt that drives me nuts sometimes. So that's why I remember pulling in around 1, because all I could think about was how the squeak might attract coyotes or something. Not that I scare easily, but I used to keep a .22 in the truck just in case. Anyway, the night was super clear. You could see every star. There's hardly any light pollution out there, which is part of why they put that tower in the middle of nowhere. I set up my portable work light, and I was in the middle of checking the fuses when I caught something out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was a helicopter, because sometimes military choppers do training runs in that region. Nellis Air Force Base isn't too far away, and I've seen them passing overhead more than once. But this light, it wasn't blinking like a normal aircraft. It was more like this faint, whitish glow that just seemed to hover and then circle around the tower's silhouette. I tried to brush it off, told myself it was a trick of my eyes, but it didn't go away. I shut off my work light to get a better look. That's when I realized I wasn't imagining it. There appeared to be at least 3 separate lights, all swaying in this wide arc around the tower, like they were studying it. I had this odd feeling in my gut, like I was being watched. It's a strange sensation to describe, but it's sort of like the opposite of the comforting loneliness you usually get out there. I figured maybe I'd better get my phone and take some video, but I remembered I'd left it charging in the truck. By the time I went back to grab it, the lights had vanished. I stood there for a few minutes just half convinced I'd been daydreaming. But then, about 10 minutes later, they showed up again, except this time they were brighter. almost an electric blue color. The movement was so smooth, I couldn't believe it was a drone. Drones tend to make a distinct buzzing sound, but I heard nothing except for my own breathing. I tried to think of any possible reason for these lights. Maybe some top-secret military craft, or Orion's belt playing tricks on me. But these things were definitely circling the tower. After a couple of slow laps around it, they shot off toward the mountains in the distance. 1 second they were there. The next, they just zipped away in a blur. Now, I'd almost convinced myself to forget it. But it all came back the following day when I was fueling up in Alamo, a small town about 25 miles away from the tower site. At the gas station, this older guy in a baseball cap started telling me about how his father used to see strange orbs out by the same set of towers back in the early 1980s. He said it was the reason some folks in the area believed in UFOs. I hadn't even mentioned anything yet, so hearing him talk about orbs out there made my stomach drop. I felt guilty pressing him for more details, so I just nodded. But inside I was screaming, wanting to know more. He mentioned local rumors about experiments, hush-hush government tasks, that sort of typical conspiracy talk. Usually I brush those stories off, but this time I listened closely. A few days later, I was back at the tower around the same time, hoping everything would be normal. I forced myself to go out there because it's my job, and I had to finish the maintenance tasks. The entire drive, I kept scanning the sky. The headlights caught a few rabbits on the dusty road. The moment I rolled up to the fence, though, I got this intense feeling of being watched again. It was the exact same unease as before, and it was powerful enough to make me double-check my phone signal. No bars out there, of course, so calling 911 was off the table. I considered turning around and lying to my boss that I'd done the work, but I had to do at least a little to justify the trip. While I was fiddling with the tower's base panel, I swore I heard footsteps crunching on the gravel behind me. A normal desert night, you'd hear crickets or the wind, but this sounded too distinctly like someone deliberately pacing back and forth. Slowly, so as not to make a big display, I stood up, turned around, and pointed my flashlight across the area. I caught a fleeting glimpse of a shadow darting behind one of the steel support beams. It was upright, tall, but definitely not human. The shape was too bulky, and the movement was too hunched. My heart about leaped out of my chest. I shouted involuntarily, something along the lines of, "I know you're out there," but not actually in those exact words. Of course, there was no reply, just an unsettling silence. Then that same sickly feeling came over me, and I looked up at the top of the tower. The red safety beacon lights blinked on and off like always. But above that, I saw 2 bright orbs hovering maybe 200 feet above the tower. The next moment, they zipped out of sight faster than anything I've seen do. If that's some advanced aircraft, I can't fathom how it moves so quickly without any noise. It makes no sense to me. The rest of that night, I lay awake at the motel in Alamo, trying to rationalize everything. Part of me wonders if there's some connection between those eerie lights and that creature. Could it be unrelated? Maybe just a wild animal that decided to show up the same night. Sure. But the way the light circled the tower was too deliberate. I've never been a paranormal believer before, but after these encounters, I'm definitely starting to question a lot of what I assumed was just local myths. I'm a retired Army intelligence analyst who spent 10 years at Fort Wainwright in the mid to late 90s, mostly combing through classified reports that focused on unusual incidents across Alaska. It was all part of a broader intelligence effort, where they wanted eyes on everything from foreign aircraft movements to anomalies that just didn't fit any known category. Back then, I'd received daily intel packets spanning sightings of unidentified craft near St. Paul Island to bizarre acoustic readings under the ice in the Beaufort Sea. Most of the time, the strangest reports got filed away or brushed off as flukes, but one specific file still gnaws at me. I remember the day I first opened it because everything else in my queue seemed routine mapping updates for the region. This one was stamped with a bright red classification level. The labeling was coded in a way that was different from the standard system we used for highly sensitive ops. I can't recall the exact classification code, some complicated alphanumeric string, but it stuck out. The incident itself was dated November 1975, referencing a crash retrieval near the edge of the Denali wilderness. I thought maybe it was a domestic aircraft downed by a winter storm, but as I scanned further, it mentioned craft of unknown origin with structural features we had no design specs for. It was described as having no visible seams, no rivets, and no typical propulsion system. That alone was bizarre enough, but the attached notes indicated that a specialized retrieval team was flown in from an airfield near Anchorage to secure the crash site. I spent days going down a rabbit hole with these documents. The name of the operation was somewhere in a file that had a partial label like Northern something. I never got the full name, just glimpses. It involved a contingent of Air Force personnel, along with Army intelligence. Their operation logs mentioned quarantining an area near a remote stretch of land west of Healy, although they also mentioned a diversionary site near Clear Space Force Station, as if to deflect attention from the real location. When I tried cross-referencing the names on the sign-off sheets, half of them seemed to vanish from standard Army records. That's something I'd only ever see with really deep black projects, the kind where even the brass in the intelligence community start avoiding direct mention. I tried to piece together the timeline. The crash occurred in early November 1975, which was an especially brutal winter. Temperatures dropped well below 0 Fahrenheit at night, and rescue helicopters wouldn't normally fly in those conditions unless it was absolutely critical. The team apparently used ground transports, tracked vehicles, and a couple of heavily modified trucks that I'd never heard of before. They were described as all-terrain, but also had some sort of electromagnetic shielding installed. I read that and thought it was either a major chain of command error, or they were anticipating some phenomenon at the crash site that they didn't want messing with the electronics. Another doc mentioned a craft with some half-melted hull sections, as if it crashed at high velocity, but the interior was reportedly intact, and that's where things got even more outlandish. There were references to occupant retrieval, but the details and descriptions were blacked out. All I saw was occupant retrieval successful, transported to facility. That was it. One of the wild tangents in the files involved early communications retrieval. They apparently found something akin to a data storage device inside the craft, but none of our equipment could read it. The file said something about sending the device to a tech lab in California, no mention of which base. I've sometimes wondered if it ended up at a place like Edwards or somewhere near the old McClellan AFB. We had some advanced R&D in those days, but evidently not advanced enough for that piece of technology. I spent far too long flipping through correlated documents. Anyway, my job back then was mostly to summarize these raw reports into a bullet point distribution for the brass. But anytime I tried to mention the occupant retrieval, the lines were redacted from the final copy. I'd send my summary up, and the next day I'd find half of it blacked out, with a note telling me not to include non-substantiated data. Kind of funny, given the entire operations classification. I finally asked a liaison officer about it, suggesting maybe we should at least keep these details for historical reference. He said it was beyond his pay grade, and recommended I move on. It was that typical hush-hush response we got whenever we stumbled into top-tier secrets that never see the light of day. Another day, about a month after I first found these files, I was working late in the records room. I came across a mismatch in the log. The official record said the files I'd been reading were never checked out, but I obviously had them on my desk the week prior. When I tried to locate them again, the entire section was gone. No sign-out form, no transfer request. It's like the operation had been scrubbed from that wing of the archive. That's when it really sank in that I was poking around a place I shouldn't be. I asked a friend of mine, also Army Intel, about the missing docs. He avoided eye contact and mentioned hearing about a retrieval call in Alaska during that era, but wouldn't say more. Years later, after I'd retired, the whole situation still ate at me. I've scoured some public records about a huge hush-hush event that might match the time frame, but official references are non-existent. Every once in a while I see something pop up on a random forum that vaguely lines up with what was in those documents, but it's always anecdotal or rumor. That's all it can ever be, I guess, unless something surfaces in an official capacity. But I'm convinced there was at least one major retrieval of a craft that wasn't ours, and that the search for occupant remains, or survivors continued well beyond that initial recovery. I know your YouTube channel focuses on odd encounters and testimonies. I figured if there's anywhere these old bits of intel might resonate, it's with someone who has an audience that appreciates just how strange and intricate these cover-ups can be. I've tried putting together a coherent timeline, but it's been decades, and I don't have the docs anymore. All I can do is recall the bullet points: non-human craft, occupant retrieval, massive hush-hush protocols. There was even an indirect mention of coordination with a private contractor that specialized in specialized storage containers for unknown biological samples. My guess is they were storing tissue or remains from this craft before sending them off-site. Even if I can't prove it on paper, I'm certain it happened. While I never saw the crash site myself, reading through those documents left me with a certainty that we're not the only technology out there flying around, and that sometimes we stumble onto it in places we least expect. Frozen corners of Alaska, for instance. I doubt the public will ever see photographic evidence, or if they do, it'll be denounced as a hoax. But that's how these things go. Somebody out there has the truth locked away. The retrieval operation was real. The redacted occupant references were real. And that enormous set of paw prints around the site is one detail I still can't make sense of. Part of me wonders if the two events were connected in ways even the Army never deciphered. Anyway, that's the gist of what I remember. Take what you will from it. I wish I had kept my own notes, but you don't walk out of intelligence with a stack of classified files. I just wanted to get it off my chest after all these years. I can still picture that bright red classification banner every time I close my eyes, almost like it's burned into my memory.